The moment a powerful man laughs at the wrong person, his future quietly begins to change. The conference room on the 42nd floor of Walker Dynamics overlooked the Manhattan skyline, like the bridge of a ship built to command the world. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected rows of executives dressed in tailored suits, legal advisors reviewing contracts worth billions, and engineers whose resumes included the most prestigious universities in America. Yet despite the polished confidence filling the room, no one was speaking. A single message glowed across the massive display at the front. System failure. The silence felt heavier than any argument. Ethan Walker stood with both hands resting on the edge of the polished walnut table, his steel blue eyes locked on the frozen screen. At 39, he had become one of the youngest technology CEOs to build a company valued in the tens of billions. Investors called him brilliant. Competitors called him ruthless. Employees simply called him impossible to surprise. Since losing his wife 4 years earlier, Ethan had buried every emotion beneath discipline, precision, and work. His 8-year-old son, Noah, waited upstairs with Ethan's assistant after school every afternoon because his father rarely left the office before sunset. Success had become Ethan's language. Feelings had become something he no longer knew how to translate. Around him, software architects exchanged nervous glances. 3 weeks of non-stop work had failed to solve the mysterious system collapse, threatening the company's largest government contract. If they missed today's deadline, billions of dollars and years of reputation could disappear with a single failed presentation. One engineer cleared his throat before quietly admitting, "We've tried every patch we have." Another lowered his eyes toward the table. "We can't isolate the source." Ethan exhaled once. Slow, controlled, almost disappointed rather than angry. Then the sound of porcelain interrupted the silence. A young waitress stepped carefully between expensive leather chairs carrying a silver tray with fresh coffee. She wore a simple black uniform, her blonde hair tied neatly behind her head, moving with calm confidence that somehow seemed untouched by the tension surrounding everyone else. Claire Bennett had been assigned to serve the executive meeting because the hotel's premium dining staff was fully booked downstairs. To everyone in the room, she was invisible. Just another server refilling cups before quietly disappearing again. Ethan barely looked at her as he picked up his tablet and tapped the frozen display one last time. Nothing changed. A faint, sarcastic smile appeared on his face. Without turning fully toward her, he lifted the tablet slightly in Claire's direction. "Fix this," he said with effortless confidence, "and I'll give you $100 million. Laughter rolled across the conference room almost instantly. Some executives chuckled politely. Others looked away, embarrassed by the joke, but unwilling to challenge their CEO. Claire stopped beside the table without reacting. She didn't blush. She didn't force a smile. She simply looked at the screen for a quiet moment, then raised her eyes to Ethan with an expression so calm that the laughter faded faster than it had begun. Finally, she spoke in a voice soft enough that everyone leaned forward to hear it. "Before I touch your system," she said, "may I ask who decided the original assumptions were correct?" No one answered Claire's question. The conference room that had echoed with quiet laughter only seconds earlier settled into complete silence. The engineers looked toward one another, hoping someone else would speak first. Ethan studied her face with growing curiosity. There was no trace of sarcasm in her expression. She was not trying to embarrass anyone. She had asked the question as though it were the most natural place to begin. Finally, the lead software architect adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Our data science division established the original model 6 months ago," he replied carefully. Claire nodded once. "Has anyone questioned those assumptions since the system began failing?" Another uncomfortable silence followed. One executive slowly folded his arms. Another looked down at the presentation folder in front of him. Ethan noticed something that surprised him even more than Claire's question. His own experts were avoiding eye contact. Claire gently placed the untouched coffee pot onto the serving cart beside her. She was in no hurry. Her calm seemed completely disconnected from the urgency surrounding everyone else. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, helicopters crossed the bright afternoon sky above Manhattan, while traffic flowed beneath them in perfect rhythm. Inside the room, time felt frozen. Ethan crossed his arms. "You think the problem is not the software?" Claire met his eyes. "I do not know yet. I only know that software usually follows instructions. When intelligent systems fail all at once, I prefer to ask whether the instructions deserve the same confidence people give them. Several engineers frowned. One quietly whispered to another. Ethan heard every word but remained focused on Claire. There was something strangely familiar about the way she approached the problem. She was not chasing symptoms. She was searching for the foundation. What would you do first? Ethan asked. Claire glanced toward the large display again. I would stop asking why the system broke. She paused just long enough for everyone to listen. I would ask when everyone became certain it could never be wrong. The sentence landed with unexpected weight. Ethan felt it immediately. Confidence had always been the culture inside Walker Dynamics. Every meeting rewarded certainty. Every promotion celebrated speed. Doubt rarely received an invitation. Claire looked around the room, noticing framed awards covering the walls, magazine covers featuring Ethan's face, and shelves displaying innovation trophies collected over the past decade. Success surrounded the company so completely that it almost looked permanent. Almost. She quietly asked another question. Who approved the original training data? This time the answer came more slowly. Mr. Walker did. Someone admitted from the far end of the table. Claire did not react. She simply nodded as though another missing piece had quietly fallen into place. Ethan expected criticism. Instead, she spoke with the same steady voice. Then perhaps everyone has been trying to protect the decision instead of testing it. No accusation. No disrespect. Just observation. Ethan felt something unfamiliar settle over the room. It was not humiliation. It was honesty. For the first time in weeks, no one was pretending to have an answer. And somehow, the only person brave enough to ask the right questions was still wearing a black waitress uniform with a neatly folded white apron draped across one arm. The room remained perfectly still until Ethan slowly pulled out the chair beside him. Nobody had ever seen him hesitate during a business crisis. His decisions usually came within seconds, sharp and unquestioned. This time, he looked at Claire for several long moments before speaking. All right, he said quietly. Show me what everyone else missed. A ripple of disbelief spread across the conference table. One executive leaned toward another and whispered that allowing a hotel waitress near proprietary technology was irresponsible. Another reached for the legal documents as though preparing to stop what was about to happen. Ethan lifted one hand without looking away from Claire. The room immediately fell silent again. His authority needed no raised voice. Claire stepped closer to the display but did not touch the tablet Ethan had offered. Instead, she studied the diagrams projected across the giant screen. Hundreds of interconnected data flows stretched across the presentation like highways crossing a continent. Most people would have stared at the code. Claire watched the arrows connecting the information instead. May I ask one more question? She said. Ethan nodded. When did the failures begin? The chief operations officer answered first. 9 days ago. Claire tilted her head slightly. And what changed 10 days ago? Fingers immediately began moving across keyboards. Engineers searched deployment logs while analysts reviewed update schedules. Nearly a full minute passed before someone finally spoke. We added a new public data source to improve prediction accuracy. Claire smiled gently, not with satisfaction, but with quiet recognition. Did anyone verify whether that source measured the same definitions as your original data? Confused. Expressions appeared around the table. One analyst frowned. The numbers matched. Claire looked at him kindly. Numbers can match while meanings quietly drift apart. Ethan felt those words settle somewhere deeper than the technical discussion. He had built his company believing that measurable results always revealed the truth. Claire seemed to believe that understanding came before measurement. The lead engineer hurried through another report before stopping abruptly. His face lost its color. The external provider changed its classification standards the day before integration. Another engineer looked over his shoulder. That means our model has been learning from conflicting assumptions for more than a week. Quiet realization spread through the room like sunrise reaching every corner at once. Nobody argued. Nobody defended earlier decisions. The answer had been sitting in plain sight, hidden behind thousands of lines of flawless programming. Ethan slowly walked toward the screen, reading the report himself. Every technical diagnosis from the previous 3 weeks had focused on repairing algorithms. Not one team had questioned whether the information feeding those algorithms had silently changed. Claire folded her hands in front of her apron. Sometimes intelligent systems do exactly what we teach them to do, she said softly. The mistake belongs to the teacher, not the student. Ethan looked at her with a level of respect that had not existed 20 minutes earlier. For the first time in years, someone had entered his boardroom without a title, without credentials on display, without asking for recognition, and had quietly exposed the one weakness success had hidden from everyone else. It was not the system that had become overconfident. It was the people who believed they no longer needed to question themselves. No one moved until Ethan slowly picked up the tablet again and handed it to the lead engineer. Rebuild the model using the original classification standards, he said. Then isolate every prediction generated after the external data source changed. The engineers rushed into action with an energy that had been missing all morning. Laptops opened. Monitors filled with fresh reports. Conversations that had once sounded defensive became focused and purposeful. Claire quietly stepped back toward the serving cart, as though her role in the room had already ended. She reached for the coffee pot and began refilling empty cups with the same calm precision she had shown since entering the conference room. It was almost impossible to believe that the woman pouring coffee had just redirected the thinking of an entire technology company. Ethan watched her for a long moment before speaking again. Miss Bennett. Claire looked up. Please stay. She nodded politely, but said nothing. 10 minutes later, one of the senior engineers suddenly stood from his chair so quickly that it rolled backward across the polished floor. It is working, he said, hardly believing his own voice. Prediction accuracy is climbing back above 98%. Another analyst refreshed the dashboard. The warning messages disappeared one after another. Red indicators turned green across every monitor. Quiet applause broke out around the room, followed by relieved laughter that sounded very different from the laughter Claire had heard earlier. This time it carried gratitude instead of mockery. Ethan did not celebrate. His attention remained fixed on Claire. You solved a problem that my best engineers spent 3 weeks chasing. Claire gently shook her head. No, they solved it. I only asked different questions. Ethan considered that answer carefully. In his experience, brilliant people usually wanted recognition before results. Claire seemed interested only in the results. Recognition did not appear to matter at all. Before he could speak again, the conference room door opened. A young boy stepped inside holding a backpack almost as large as himself. His sandy blonde hair was slightly messy from the afternoon wind, and he paused when he realized he had interrupted an important meeting. Sorry, Dad, Noah said softly. Mrs. Harper said your meeting was almost over. Ethan's expression changed immediately. The hard edges that had defined his face throughout the afternoon softened almost without effort. It is all right, buddy. Come. Here. Noah walked across the room, greeting a few familiar executives before stopping beside his father. His curious eyes wandered toward Claire, who offered him a warm smile. He smiled back shyly. Claire noticed the sketchbook tucked beneath his arm, its corners worn from frequent use. She also noticed something else. Noah avoided looking directly at the crowded room, keeping his attention on familiar objects instead of unfamiliar faces. Ethan rested a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. This is Noah. Claire nodded. It is nice to meet you. Noah answered so quietly that only she could hear him. Nice to meet you too. His voice was gentle, careful, almost hesitant. Claire sensed a quiet loneliness behind his polite smile. She did not ask questions. She simply noticed, just as she had noticed the invisible flaw inside the company's system. Sometimes the most important answers were hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough to truly see them. The atmosphere inside the conference room had completely changed, yet Claire behaved exactly as she had when she first walked through the door. She gathered empty coffee cups, neatly arranged used napkins onto her serving tray, and quietly thanked one of the assistants for moving a chair out of her way. There was no sign that she had just saved one of the largest contracts in Walker Dynamics history. Ethan noticed it immediately. Most people who impressed him wanted something afterward. A promotion, an introduction, an opportunity. Claire simply resumed doing her job. Noah remained standing beside his father, watching her with quiet curiosity. Unlike the executives, he was not interested in billion-dollar contracts or advanced technology. He was watching the kindness in her movements. Claire never rushed. She smiled naturally at every person she passed, whether they were a senior executive or a member of the hotel staff collecting empty dishes. Do you draw? Claire asked gently after noticing the sketchbook tucked under Noah's arm. The boy looked down before answering. Sometimes. Ethan smiled faintly. He says sometimes, but he fills one of those every month. Noah shrugged, slightly embarrassed by the compliment. Claire crouched just enough to speak at his eye level without making the moment feel unusual. What do you like to draw? Noah hesitated for several seconds. Ethan almost answered for him before stopping himself. Finally, the boy opened the sketchbook a few inches. Inside were detailed pencil drawings of buildings, bridges, trains, and city skylines. Every line was remarkably precise. Every window seemed perfectly measured. Claire looked carefully at one page before asking another simple question. Do you always start with the smallest details? Noah looked surprised. How did you know? Because the windows are finished before the buildings are. Noah stared at her for a moment, then slowly nodded. I cannot picture the whole thing until the little parts make sense. Claire smiled warmly. That is not a weakness. She pointed gently toward one unfinished drawing. Some people understand the big picture first. Others build the picture one careful piece at a time. Both ways can create something beautiful. Ethan quietly listened from only a few feet away. The conversation lasted less than a minute, yet it felt different from every discussion Noah had with teachers, tutors, or child specialists over the past several years. Nobody was trying to correct him. Nobody was telling him to change. Claire simply understood the way he thought without asking him to become someone else. Noah relaxed enough to turn another page in his sketchbook. This one is my favorite. It showed a bridge stretching across a river at sunset. Claire admired the careful pencil shading before asking, Did you imagine this? Noah shook his head. I remembered it. Claire looked at Ethan. He notices details that most people never see. Ethan lowered his eyes toward his son. He had heard similar words before, but never spoken with such quiet certainty. Before he could respond, his phone vibrated with an incoming message confirming that the system restoration had been completed successfully. The contract was secure. The crisis was over. Yet for reasons he could not explain, Ethan found himself thinking less about the company he had just saved and more about the waitress who somehow understood both complicated systems and a quiet little boy with equal patience. The conference room gradually emptied as relieved executives hurried to prepare for the rescheduled presentation. Conversations that had been filled with anxiety only an hour earlier now carried cautious optimism. Engineers thanked one another. Lawyers gathered revised documents. Assistants answered calls from investors waiting for updates. Amid all the movement, Claire quietly lifted the last stack of empty cups onto her tray. She was almost at the door when Ethan's voice stopped her. Miss Bennett. She turned with the same calm expression she had worn all afternoon. Would you stay for a few more minutes? Claire glanced toward the hallway where the banquet manager was organizing the serving staff. I still have tables waiting downstairs. Ethan nodded respectfully. I will make certain your manager understands. Before Claire could answer, the banquet manager himself appeared at the doorway, smiling more warmly than she had ever seen before. Take your time, Claire. We will cover your section. She thanked him with a quiet smile before setting the tray back onto the service cart. Ethan motioned toward one of the empty chairs. Please. Claire sat without hesitation, but also without excitement. She folded her hands neatly in her lap, while Ethan remained standing beside the window overlooking the city. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. I have spent 20 years interviewing people from the best universities in the world. He looked directly at her. None of them approached today's problem the way you did. Claire answered softly. Because they were trying to prove they were right. I was only trying to discover what was true. Ethan let the sentence settle. It sounded simple, yet it challenged almost every leadership principle that had built his career. Where did you learn to think like that? Claire smiled politely. Life teaches different lessons than classrooms. It was not an evasive answer. It was simply complete. Ethan realized she had no interest in impressing him with credentials or accomplishments. Noah quietly colored. At the far end of the table, while pretending not to listen, but every few moments he glanced toward Claire with obvious curiosity. Ethan noticed his son seemed unusually relaxed. Usually after spending an afternoon in crowded offices, Noah became withdrawn and exhausted. Today he remained peaceful, occasionally sketching another line across the page. Claire noticed it too. He likes predictable patterns, she said gently. Ethan looked surprised. How could you tell? The way he studies every room before sitting down. The way he arranges his pencils in the same order every time. The way he remembers tiny details other people overlook. Ethan slowly nodded. His teachers have mentioned those things. Claire smiled toward Noah. Those qualities often become remarkable strengths when people stop treating them like flaws. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment. He remembered years of appointments with specialists, educational consultants, and therapists. Every conversation had focused on what Noah struggled with. Claire was the first person who had spoken only about what Noah already did well. Before Ethan could respond, Noah quietly stood and walked over carrying his sketchbook. Without saying a word, he carefully tore out the drawing of the bridge and held it toward Claire. "You can have this," he said. Claire accepted the drawing with genuine gratitude, studying every careful pencil line. "Thank you, Noah. I will take very good care of it." The boy smiled, a little more confidently than before. Ethan watched the exchange in silence, realizing that his son rarely gave away his drawings. They were precious to him. Yet somehow, after only a few minutes with a waitress everyone else had overlooked, Noah had chosen to share something he almost never shared with anyone. Claire carefully slipped Noah's drawing into the protective folder she carried with her order book, treating it with the same respect someone else might reserve for an expensive contract. Noah noticed the gesture immediately. His shoulders relaxed, and for the first time that afternoon he looked directly into her eyes without hesitation. Ethan had spent years hoping to see moments like that happen. Naturally, most conversations with new adults ended politely but awkwardly. Claire had somehow earned Noah's trust without asking for it. Ethan slowly walked back toward the conference table and reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He removed a sleek black business card and placed it in front of Claire. "Walker Dynamics has positions that would challenge almost anyone in the technology industry," he said. "Whatever you are earning here, I will multiply it many times over. I would like you to come work for me." Claire looked at the card but made no effort to pick it up. Her expression remained warm, though thoughtful. "That is generous," she replied, "but I cannot accept." Several executives who had remained behind quietly exchanged surprised glances. They had watched highly accomplished professionals compete for opportunities to work with Ethan Walker. No one simply declined. Ethan himself looked genuinely puzzled rather than offended. "May I ask why?" Claire folded her hands together. "Because you are offering me a position before you know who I am." Ethan smiled slightly. "I know enough to understand that my company needs people who think the way you do." Claire shook her head gently. "You know what I did today? That is different from knowing who I am every other day." The distinction lingered in the room. Ethan realized she was right. One extraordinary afternoon did not reveal an entire person. It only revealed one chapter. Noah quietly returned to his chair and continued sketching while listening to every word. Claire stood and glanced toward the windows where late afternoon sunlight reflected across the buildings of Midtown Manhattan. "People often make decisions too quickly," she said softly. "Sometimes they underestimate someone because of a uniform. Sometimes they admire someone for a single success. Both can be mistakes." Ethan found himself nodding before he realized it. His first judgment of Claire had lasted less than a second. He had seen a waitress carrying coffee and assumed he understood her limits. Now he wondered how many other remarkable people he had overlooked throughout his career simply because they arrived wearing the wrong uniform. One of the senior vice presidents quietly approached with an updated report. "The client has accepted the revised demonstration. They want to proceed with the contract." Relief spread across the room once more, but Ethan barely glanced at the document. His attention remained on Claire. "At least allow me to thank you properly," he said. Claire smiled. "You already have." Ethan looked confused. "How?" She nodded toward Noah. "You listened when your son spoke. You did not interrupt him once. That matters more than you probably realize." Ethan instinctively looked toward Noah, who was adding careful lines to another bridge inside his sketchbook. He suddenly remembered all the evenings he had answered electronic mail while Noah talked about trains, buildings, and drawings. How many moments had he only half heard? Claire reached for her serving tray once again. "Your company will recover because talented people work together," she said. "The important question is whether you will remember why today happened after the crisis is forgotten." With those words, she quietly walked toward the door, leaving Ethan standing in complete silence, holding a business card that suddenly seemed far less valuable than the lesson he had just received. Claire stepped into the hallway, and the familiar sounds of the hotel immediately returned. Elevator chimes echoed through the marble lobby. Guests checked into elegant suites. Servers hurried between banquet rooms carrying polished silver trays. Within seconds, she was once again just another member of the hotel staff. She tied her apron securely, thanked a coworker for covering her tables, and returned to the restaurant as though the extraordinary afternoon had never happened. Upstairs, however, Ethan remained standing near the conference room window long after everyone else had left. The signed contract rested neatly inside a leather portfolio on the table, yet it no longer felt like the day's greatest victory. He replayed every conversation with Claire in his mind. She had never once tried to impress him. She had never mentioned her education, her accomplishments, or her past. She had simply asked better questions than everyone else. Ethan had spent most of his career believing intelligence announced itself loudly. Today he had discovered that genuine wisdom often arrived quietly. Noah tugged gently on his father's sleeve. "Dad." Ethan looked down immediately. "Yes, buddy." Noah hesitated before speaking. "Can we eat downstairs?" Ethan smiled. "You are hungry." Noah nodded. "I want the grilled cheese." Then, after a brief pause, he added, "And maybe Claire is still working." Ethan looked at his son with quiet surprise. Noah rarely asked to meet new people again after a first conversation. Usually he preferred familiar routines and familiar faces. The request alone meant something important had happened. "All right," Ethan said. "Let us have dinner before we go home." 20 minutes later, father and son entered the hotel's main restaurant. The dinner rush had already begun. Soft piano music drifted through the dining room, while warm lighting reflected across crystal glasses and polished wood tables. Claire moved gracefully between guests, greeting each person with the same calm smile she had shown upstairs. She welcomed an elderly couple celebrating an anniversary with exactly the same kindness she offered a young family sharing dessert after a baseball game. There was no difference in her attention, no difference in her respect. Ethan noticed that detail immediately. She treated every person as though they mattered equally. When Claire finally reached their table, she looked pleasantly surprised to see them. "Good evening," she said. "I did not expect to see you again today." Noah smiled first. "I wanted the grilled cheese." Claire laughed softly. "That is an excellent reason to come back." She handed him a menu even though both of them knew exactly what he planned to order. Ethan watched the brief exchange. Noah's shoulders were relaxed. His voice sounded more comfortable than it had upstairs. It was a small change, almost invisible to anyone who did not know him well. But Ethan noticed every detail. Claire wrote down their order before Noah quietly reached into his backpack. He pulled out another drawing and carefully placed it on the table. "I made this while we were waiting," he said. Claire looked down at the page. It showed a tall office building connected to a bridge stretching toward the setting sun. Standing on the bridge were 3 small figures. One was a father. One was a little boy. The third wore a simple apron. Claire looked at the drawing for a long moment before raising her eyes. She smiled gently, understanding that sometimes the most meaningful thank you was never spoken aloud. Claire carefully handed the drawing back to Noah after admiring every detail. "Would you sign your name for me?" she asked gently. Noah blinked with surprise. Most adults complimented his drawings and then moved on. None had ever asked for his signature. He slowly wrote his name in the lower corner with careful block letters before sliding the page toward her again. Claire smiled. "Thank you. Someday this signature may become very important." Noah looked up with quiet curiosity. "You really think so?" "I do," Claire answered without hesitation. People who notice what others overlook often build things the rest of us only imagine. Ethan watched his son's face brighten in a way that money had never been able to buy. He had purchased the finest educational software, hired respected tutors, and enrolled Noah in specialized programs. Yet a simple sentence from Claire had accomplished something entirely different. It had given his son confidence instead of correction. Dinner arrived a few minutes later, and Claire quietly excused herself to help another table. Ethan noticed that she never lingered longer than necessary with anyone, including them. Every guest received the same thoughtful attention. Every conversation ended with the same graceful professionalism. There was no attempt to cultivate influential customers or seek special treatment. She simply served people well. As Noah happily ate his grilled cheese sandwich, Ethan found himself watching Claire move through the restaurant. She remembered names without checking reservation cards. She noticed when an elderly gentleman reached for his cane before anyone else stood to help. She quietly brought a coloring page to a restless little girl before her parents had time to apologize. Small moments, almost invisible, yet together they revealed a pattern more impressive than any resume. Ethan finally understood what had unsettled him all afternoon. Claire did not merely solve problems. She noticed people. His phone buzzed softly against the table. It was a message from his chief technology officer. We ran a deeper audit after rebuilding the model. Claire's questions uncovered another hidden vulnerability. If we had launched next month without finding it, the financial damage could have reached several $billion. Ethan slowly lowered the phone. Claire had never claimed she fixed the company. She had insisted the engineers deserved the credit. Yet her quiet observations had prevented a disaster no one else had even discovered. When Claire returned with fresh iced tea, Ethan looked at her with renewed respect. "There is something I still do not understand," he admitted. "You think like an experienced systems architect. You communicate like a teacher. Yet you choose to work here." Claire refilled Noah's glass before answering. "Sometimes where a person works tells you less than why they chose to be there." Ethan remained silent. She continued with a gentle smile. "Every table teaches me something. Every conversation reminds me that every person carries a story nobody else can see." Noah looked between them before quietly asking, "Do you like being a waitress?" Claire's answer came without the slightest pause. "Yes, because every day gives me another chance to make someone's day a little lighter. Titles change. Kindness does not." Ethan looked around the elegant dining room filled with successful people discussing investments, mergers, and quarterly reports. Then he looked back at Claire standing in a simple black apron with Noah's signed drawing carefully protected inside her folder. For the first time in many years, he wondered whether the most successful person in the room was the one no one had thought to admire when the day began. When dinner was over, Noah carefully closed his sketchbook and slipped it back into his backpack. Instead of reaching for his father's hand as he usually did before leaving unfamiliar places, he walked toward Claire on his own. She was arranging clean silverware beside the service station when she noticed him approaching. "Thank you for dinner," Noah said softly. Claire smiled. "I only carried the plate. You were the one who made the evening memorable." Noah hesitated for a moment before asking the question that had clearly been waiting in his mind all night. "Will I see you again?" Claire looked briefly toward Ethan before answering. "The world has an interesting way of bringing thoughtful people back together." Noah nodded as though that answer made perfect sense. Ethan settled the check and quietly added a generous gratuity. When Claire returned with the receipt, she noticed that the amount was far larger than the cost of the meal. She gently placed the folder back in front of Ethan. "I think there has been a mistake." Ethan looked at the receipt and smiled faintly. "There has not." Claire shook her head. "Your gratitude is appreciated, but this is too much for serving dinner." Ethan met her eyes. "It is not for dinner." Claire understood immediately. She slowly slid the folder back toward him. "Then I cannot accept it." Ethan looked genuinely puzzled. "Why?" Claire answered with the same calm certainty she had carried throughout the day. "Because if I accept payment for simply doing what I believe is right, eventually I may forget why I started doing it in the first place." The words settled quietly between them. Ethan had negotiated with world leaders, investors, and industry giants. Very few people ever declined something valuable when it was freely offered. Claire declined without hesitation because her principles were worth more to her than the number written on a receipt. Ethan folded the receipt and placed it back inside his wallet without another argument. For the first time in a long while, losing a negotiation did not feel like losing at all. As Ethan and Noah walked toward the lobby, the hotel manager hurried across the polished marble floor with obvious excitement. "Mr. Walker," he called, "I wanted to thank you again for choosing our hotel." Ethan smiled politely before asking a question that surprised even himself. "How long has Claire Bennett worked here?" The manager's expression softened. "Almost 3 years. She seems exceptionally qualified." The manager nodded. "She has turned down promotions more than once. She says she enjoys being where she can help people face to face." Ethan looked back toward the restaurant entrance where Claire was welcoming another family with the same warm smile she had offered everyone else that evening. "Does she always solve impossible problems?" The manager laughed quietly. Not always the kind that involve technology. But somehow people leave happier than they arrived. That has been true since her first day. Ethan thanked him and headed toward the revolving doors with Noah beside him. Outside, the cool Manhattan evening carried the familiar sounds of taxis, distant sirens, and conversations drifting through the sidewalks. Noah looked up at his father. "Dad." Ethan glanced down. "Yes." Noah smiled. Today was better than going to the office. Ethan looked back one last time through the glass doors. Claire was laughing gently with an elderly couple while helping them into their coats. She had already moved on to the next person who needed a little kindness, never expecting recognition, never asking for applause. Ethan realized that the $100 million he had jokingly offered earlier that day could never purchase the quiet wisdom she carried so naturally. Some things were simply too valuable to have a price. The next morning, Ethan arrived at Walker Dynamics earlier than anyone else. The city outside was still wrapped in the pale blue light that appeared just before sunrise, but his office lights were already on. Instead of opening financial reports, he unfolded Noah's bridge drawing and placed it carefully on his desk beside the day's meeting schedule. For several quiet minutes, he simply looked at it. The three figures standing together on the bridge seemed strangely symbolic now. One represented success. One represented hope. The third represented something Ethan had spent years overlooking: perspective. His chief technology officer knocked gently before entering. "The engineering team finished the complete review overnight," she said, handing him a thick report. "There is something you should see." Ethan opened the first page. Every vulnerability discovered after Claire's questions had been documented in detail. The engineers estimated that if the hidden flaws had remained undetected, the company could have faced years of legal disputes, failed contracts, and irreversible damage to its reputation. The numbers filled several pages, yet Ethan found himself focusing on a single handwritten note attached to the report. It read, "We stopped trying to defend our work and started questioning it." That changed everything. Ethan quietly smiled. Those words sounded remarkably familiar. Later that morning, he gathered every department leader inside the same conference room where Claire had stood the day before. The giant display behind him showed no financial projections and no quarterly targets. Instead, one sentence appeared across the screen: "Ask better questions before searching for better answers." The executives looked at one another in surprise. Ethan spoke calmly. "Yesterday, I learned something that none of my business schools, leadership seminars, or board meetings ever taught me. Expertise becomes dangerous the moment it believes it no longer needs humility." The room remained silent. No one interrupted. Ethan continued, "Beginning today, every major decision inside this company will include one mandatory question: what assumptions have we failed to challenge?" Several executives nodded slowly. Others wrote the sentence into their notebooks. The culture inside Walker Dynamics began changing before the meeting had even ended. Meanwhile, several blocks away, Claire began another ordinary shift at the hotel. She greeted guests, polished glasses, arranged fresh flowers on empty tables, and welcomed travelers who had no idea she had quietly influenced one of the largest technology companies in New York less than 24 hours earlier. She never mentioned it. She never expected anyone else to mention it either. Around noon, the hotel receptionist approached her with a puzzled expression. "Claire, there is a delivery for you." Claire walked to the front desk where a small package wrapped in plain brown paper rested. Beside the reservation book, there was no company logo, no expensive presentation, only a simple handwritten card attached with blue string. She opened the envelope and read a single sentence written in careful black ink. "Thank you for reminding me that leadership begins with listening." Beneath the message was no signature, only the small sketch of a bridge drawn in the corner exactly the way Noah had drawn it the night before. Claire smiled quietly. She understood immediately who had sent it. She looked through the hotel windows toward the busy Manhattan streets, gently folded the card, and placed it inside the same folder where Noah's signed drawing rested safely. Some gifts were valuable because of their price. Others became priceless because they proved that a human heart had truly changed. 3 weeks passed, and autumn slowly painted Manhattan with shades of gold and amber. Inside Walker Dynamics, the changes Ethan had introduced continued spreading through every department. Meetings became quieter, but more thoughtful. Junior engineers who had once remained silent now found themselves invited to question assumptions alongside senior executives. Mistakes were no longer hidden out of fear. They became opportunities to learn before they became expensive lessons. The company was becoming stronger, not because its technology had changed, but because its culture had. One Friday afternoon, Ethan glanced at the framed photograph of his late wife that rested beside Noah's latest bridge drawing. For the first time in years, those two memories no longer reminded him only of loss. They reminded him of responsibility. He closed his laptop early and looked toward his assistant. "Please clear the rest of my afternoon." She looked surprised. "You have 2 investor meetings." Ethan smiled gently. "They can wait until Monday." 20 minutes later, he and Noah walked through the familiar entrance of the hotel. The lobby manager greeted them warmly, already recognizing the pair from their previous visit. "Good afternoon, Mr. Walker." Ethan smiled. "Is Claire working today?" The manager nodded toward the restaurant. "She is helping with a community lunch event in our private dining room." Ethan and Noah quietly followed the hallway until they reached a large room filled with local senior citizens, veterans, and volunteers sharing a simple meal together. Claire moved from table to table with the same quiet grace she had shown during the executive meeting. She laughed with an elderly woman celebrating her 91st birthday. She patiently listened to a retired teacher describing photographs of her grandchildren. She knelt beside a little boy who had dropped his crayons and helped him gather every color before returning to her work. There were no billion-dollar contracts here, no famous investors, no influential executives. Yet Claire served every person with exactly the same respect. Ethan remained near the doorway, saying nothing. Noah looked up at him and whispered, "She treats everyone like they matter." Ethan slowly nodded. "That is because they do." Claire finally noticed them and walked over with her familiar calm smile. "Good afternoon. It is nice to see both of you again." Ethan looked around the room before speaking. "I think I understand something now that I completely missed before." Claire waited quietly. "The reason you are exceptional has very little to do with technology." Claire smiled but did not interrupt. Ethan continued, "You notice people before you notice positions. You solve human problems before technical ones. That is why you saw what none of us could." Claire folded her hands gently. "Technology reflects the people who build it. If we stop understanding people, eventually our systems begin reflecting that blindness too." Ethan laughed softly. "That might be the most valuable leadership lesson I have ever received." Noah reached into his backpack once again and carefully removed a small wooden frame. Inside it was the bridge drawing Claire had asked him to sign weeks earlier, but this time he had made a second copy just for her. Across the bottom, he had written, "Thank you for helping me see my own strengths." Claire accepted the frame with visible emotion, though her composure never disappeared. "I will treasure this," she said quietly. Ethan looked at his son, then at Claire, and realized that the greatest investment he had made that year was not measured in dollars, technology, or contracts. It was measured in the quiet transformation of 2 hearts, one belonging to a father who had learned to listen, and the other belonging to a little boy who had finally begun believing in himself. Winter arrived quietly, carrying crisp air through the streets of Manhattan and dusting the city with the season's first light snowfall. Months had passed since an ordinary afternoon had transformed far more than a technology company. Walker Dynamics continued to thrive, but employees now spoke less about quarterly records and more about curiosity, humility, and listening. New engineers often heard the story of the meeting where one unexpected question changed everything, although very few people knew the name of the woman who had first asked it. Claire preferred it that way. She continued welcoming guests each day with the same calm smile, never seeking recognition for moments that had quietly altered the lives of people she barely knew. One evening, after finishing another shift, she stepped outside the hotel, carrying her familiar folder beneath one arm. Inside were only 3 things she considered truly valuable. Noah's first signed drawing, the handwritten card with the small bridge sketched in one corner, and the second framed drawing he had later given her as a gift. None of them had financial value. Together, they reminded her that kindness always traveled farther than people expected. Across the street, a black sedan slowed to the curb. Ethan and Noah stepped onto the sidewalk, bundled in warm coats against the cold evening wind. Noah noticed Claire first, and waved with unmistakable excitement. Claire smiled and crossed the street carefully to greet them. Ethan held a small paper bag in one hand. "We were hoping we might find you before your shift ended," he said. Claire looked at the bag with curiosity. Ethan handed it to her. Inside was a simple ceramic coffee mug, handmade rather than expensive. Across its side, in Noah's careful handwriting, were the words, "Ask better questions." Claire laughed softly, touched by the thoughtful gift. "This may be the nicest coffee mug I have ever owned." Noah smiled proudly. "I painted it myself." Claire thanked him warmly before looking at Ethan. "You did not need to bring me anything." Ethan shook his head. "Actually, I did." He paused, searching for the right words. "Months ago, I thought success meant having the right answers before everyone else. You taught me that real leadership begins with asking better questions, listening more carefully, and remembering that every person deserves respect before they earn admiration." Claire lowered her eyes for a brief moment, humbled by his honesty. "I only reminded you of something that was already inside you." Ethan smiled. "Perhaps, but some reminders change a life." Snowflakes drifted gently between them as city lights reflected across the sidewalks. Noah looked up at both adults before quietly taking his father's hand. It had become a habit now instead of an exception. Ethan noticed it immediately and smiled with quiet gratitude. They stood together for another peaceful moment before Claire wished them both a wonderful evening and turned toward the subway entrance. She walked away wearing the same simple black coat she had owned since the beginning of the story. No expensive title had changed her. No extraordinary praise had changed her. She remained exactly who she had always been. Ethan watched until she disappeared into the crowd. Then he looked down at Noah, who was still smiling. "Dad," Noah said softly. "I think she fixed more than the computer." Ethan squeezed his son's hand gently and nodded. "She certainly did." As father and son walked home through the softly falling snow, Ethan realized that the greatest wealth he would ever possess could never be measured in dollars, buildings, or contracts. It would always be measured by the people who quietly raised his standards instead of their voices. Because the world often celebrates the loudest person in the room, but life has a remarkable way of revealing that the quiet ones are rarely ordinary.